Welcome everyone to this week's session and the last session of defining and sustaining a values-based culture. Today we will be discussing measures to assess the impact. In the session, we will be reviewing the following objectives. Our presenter, as usual, is Steve Wiley, president of CEEK and author of Navigate Chaos, a #1 bestseller on Amazon, who is on a personal mission to rid the world of zombies in the workplace. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Steve.
All right, thank you, Maggie. Bear with me, just going to share a screen. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for sticking with us through this series. If you've been with us from the beginning, through the first 6 episodes of the series, I've shared with you a methodology and approach to be intentional about your culture, to minimize the degree of hypocrisy, which in turn we contend will enhance engagement, and to be intentional about those values that differentiate your organization. And so we've gone through that whole approach. You can go back and look at all the episodes, the videos, the slides, everything else is on our landing page. But the question becomes, what good is it if there's no impact? And so today is really about how do you measure the impact of your work on intentional culture? And as usual, just dive in with a question. Now, if you want, you can respond in chat, but this is more of a rhetorical question for you. How do you know your culture is working? How do you know that it's had an impact that you desire, that it is enhancing engagement, that it is enhancing business results? You know, just this week, I found an article or a report from Gartner. It's really about the human capital management technologies and how they define, measure, and understand, help you do that in organizations to measure and evaluate your culture. Just came out in April. The 3rd sentence in says, organizations cannot be successful in any aspect of a culture strategy without an understanding of the gaps between leaders and employees' perceptions. They later define these gaps in terms of values and behaviors. This is exactly what we're talking about. Now, the interesting thing in this article, I started counting, I lost track over time, but they referenced 70 different tools, 70 different technologies that can be employed to measure and track your culture. My goal today is to make it a lot simpler for you. You don't need to implement 5 different tools or 6 different vendors. You can do this. If you've done the work, you can do this right now. You don't need to make a huge investment, and that's what today is all about. So the objectives, as Maggie had alluded to, really going to start with how do you assess the culture of your team? I'm going to give you a simple, quick, easy approach. If you've done the other work on intentional culture, this is not hard. Don't overcomplicate it. And then we're going to talk about an approach about determining the impact. How do you correlate the work you're doing on culture to engagement and business results, things that we say will have an impact on? And then finally, I'm just going to share a couple of examples about interpreting that information. So if you start to track this data, that which is important, how do you adapt? How do you interpret that data and make changes that will enhance your organization, your team, whatever it may be? We've talked about the approach every week now, this GEAR methodology. Again, I'll just reiterate that you can go out after the session. We already have the activity worksheet for this session available. You can go out and give you further guidance about how to apply what we're talking about today. So I encourage you to go out and do that. And if you're looking for any feedback about any aspect of this series, I welcome the conversation. So feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. You've seen this before. If you've been with us, this is our overarching approach. I'm going to present it in a little different light today, but most organizations have their compelling purpose defined in terms of a mission and vision. I challenge you, even if you lead a small team within an organization, what's your mission or what's your personal mission to do those things? We then laid out the foundation of intentional culture, values-based culture. I'll come back to that in a minute. The last 3 episodes, we've focused on how do you communicate that into the organization? How do you train and coach that so it becomes pervasive throughout the organization? Last week, we talked about how do you get it right from the start? How do you hire for the right fit in your culture? Well, today, again, we're going to focus on how do you know it's working? And some may say that, well, this is this is soft. You can't really measure culture. Well, we set the baseline for, or the foundation for intentional culture defined by the values of your organization. And we have this fundamental belief that's when your professed values differ from demonstrated behaviors, that engagement will tank. And so you can measure that. And really the measurement is about that degree of hypocrisy that resides in an organization. And as Gartner will tell us, it's all about perception. Perception is reality. So it is not difficult. You have done the work. If you've developed your intentional culture in terms of the behaviors and rituals that reinforce your values, the work's there. So if you do nothing else, we simply encourage you to measure the degree of hypocrisy within the organization. So how do you do that? Simply put, you take your values and you take your behaviors and you take your rituals and you convert those into a frequency survey. It's not hard. These are our right to play values. We're authentic, we're honest, we're empathetic, we're humble, we're accountable. We just want to do a self-assessment and know where we stand collectively and individually. Now, right to play values, these are the ones that we expect in the organization. It would raise red flags if we have scores in the sometimes or seldom or, God forbid, almost never. I would expect right to play values that we are scoring often and almost always. Do the same thing for core values. These are the differentiators. These are the ones that they're the nice to have. This is what's going to differentiate you in service to your clients, your colleagues, your community. So there may be some scores that get into that sometimes or seldom range, but you're going to work on training and communicating and coaching to make this pervasive and hiring for the right cultural fit. But you measure the degree, and we do these in terms of the behaviors that reinforce each of those values. So again, this is ours. We've got passion, we've got integrity, we've got creativity as core values and the behaviors that reinforce them. We translate it to a frequency survey. Same thing with the rituals. Now the rituals, much like the right to play values, I would be concerned if we're not getting all scores that say often or almost always, because the rituals are a very prescribed application of your values and behaviors. They are expected to occur on whatever frequency they are defined, whether that's weekly, daily, monthly, yearly, or when some other event happens. So I'd be concerned, and maybe we start to question, well, is this ritual really working for us, or do we need some new rituals if we're getting sometimes or seldom, then it's not being embraced by the organization. And so if you do nothing else, measure this. You know, I'll give you some examples here of how to track the scores. Just keep an evaluation. You really want to be above 4 across the board, but you can start to take a look at this and measure it over time. I would suggest you do this twice a year at least. You could do it annually, you could do it quarterly. The other thing to consider, you'll notice all these statements are made in terms of my colleagues or my colleagues and I. Now, if you're in a larger organization where you might have hundreds of employees and multiple supervisors, each of whom have 5 or more reporting to them, you may do this survey twice. In other words, each question you repeat. The first question is my colleagues and I, or my colleagues do whatever the value or behavior is. And the second is my supervisor or my boss. Because a lot of times we want to see if there's a discrepancy between what leadership does and what the rest of the organization does. And sometimes when you have this gap between leadership and the organization, and Gartner speaks to this loud and clear, that is when engagement actually just tanks. And so you want to be able to assess and make sure that the leadership in your organization are living the culture and the values of the organization. It's not hard. We use SurveyMonkey. You can implement this tomorrow if you've done the work on your intentional culture. And so let me come back to then this overarching approach. We've got this overarching approach for intentional culture plans. You can go out to the landing page. We'll give you some guidance as far as the steps that you might take to measure, to evaluate, to build accountability. You can see here on this slide, these are example outputs like we've shared before. Cultural assessment survey, that's what I just showed you. All that is taking the work you've already done and translating that to a frequency survey. and measuring the perception, and perception is reality. You want to determine what level of hypocrisy may or may not exist in the organization. Second, you just track that over time. You see how you're doing, and you respond, and you assess that. If you do nothing else, you're making great progress right there, and you don't have to invest in a dozen tools to make this happen, or one major product to make this happen. You can leverage what's available to you in your organization right now. I'll spend the majority of the remainder of this time just talking about this implementation of that and how you correlate it to engagement and to business results, because our belief is that intentional culture is the glue between engagement and business results. And we'll show you how you can all you need to do is align those things and track the correlation. Now, I have two other items in here as far as potential outputs: ad hoc awareness assessments. This could simply be taking your cultural assessment, your survey, and doing a weekly question, monthly question, whatever it may be. We have a ritual where we talk about some aspect of our culture on a monthly basis. Some of our clients do this on a weekly basis. They have a standing meeting. They talk about their culture. Well, what if you just took one question, one frequency question that's related to a behavior or value that you're going to discuss as part of that meeting, and just ask that question in anticipation of that meeting? How are we doing? And then you're getting real-time feedback, and you can have a conversation. So it's just keeping that culture, those values, those behaviors, those rituals, keeping it present and accountable. So again, it's not just the poster on the wall, but we're talking about this. We're holding ourselves accountable on a frequent basis. And so that's what ad hoc awareness assessments. Again, you don't have to invest in anything. If you have an email system, you can implement a survey in your email system. If you do Zoom meetings, you could just pull it up as a poll question in your Zoom meeting. You can do these things. Holding yourselves accountable. And again, lastly, holding ourselves accountable, we assess this as we assess our values and our behaviors as part of our employee development discussions. We're pursuing those on a monthly basis, but whether you do this monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annual basis, just encourage you to include the how in performance discussions. In the case of right to play values, we ask our staff to self-report. How are we doing? Where and how have you struggled with right to play values? And in case of core values, it's more where and how are you demonstrating the core values? And if someone struggled with the right to play value, that's okay, as long as they acknowledge it, because they're holding themselves accountable, which is one of our right to play values. In the case of the core values, we want to know where they're being creative and innovative to implement those values in service to their clients and colleagues. So I encourage you to consider adding this type of assessment into your employee development discussions. So let's go back to this item 3 about correlation. How do you correlate your culture results to engagement, to business results? And again, just as a reminder, I already showed you this, we measure hypocrisy. We track over time how we're doing relative to our culture survey scores. Well, guess what? Many organizations already do this. Many measure engagement. Maybe you already measure engagement. This is just an example of Sure People, a partner of ours that we think offers a great suite of tools that kind of correlate business results, engagement, and culture results, things of that nature. It can be anything. And engagement is really a measure of the degree of passion, the degree that someone is actually inspired by what they do, that they are driven to be successful. And so whatever, if you have a tool that you already use, don't reinvent the wheel. If you don't have a tool, I mean, we use SurveyMonkey. They offer a free engagement survey. You can customize that. You do not have to make a huge investment. Just track engagement. And I recommend you do it on the same or similar frequency to which you are tracking your culture, measuring hypocrisy, measuring engagement. We contend that the two should go hand in hand. There could be discrepancies between the two, which raises some questions that we can start to dig into. So just like you do with your culture scores, you track the scores over time and you begin to correlate. And I'll show you what that looks like as we go forward here. Just how do you start to correlate and see where things are in alignment. So now we've got culture survey, we've got engagement survey. Simple, don't need to overcomplicate it. They don't have to be hundreds of questions. Keep it simple. But really now you want to start looking at what are your business results that you desire. This gets back to strategic planning and measuring what's important to you as an organization. Now, I'll share some examples here, but this could be anything. It is whatever you currently measure. Now, in many businesses, obviously, revenue is a key metric, profitability. For each of these, I give you some feedback from the Gallup State of the American Workforce Report, where they contend that engagement will drive those business results. And so they're sharing data that essentially proves that higher engagement scores will lead to enhanced business results. Now, it's not always going to be the case. There may be anomalies. But as you can see on the right side here, where we shared this earlier, we have this foundational belief that a healthy, engaged workforce is fertile ground for a growing or successful organization. We contend that the counter is true as well. So if you're doing well with revenue and profitability, you're more likely to have an engaged and inspired workforce. And we contend that this intentional values-based culture that is the glue between those two things. And that works for whatever your business results are. It could be client satisfaction. Again, Gallup showing significantly higher client satisfaction. Well, if you have satisfied clients, you're also more likely to have an engaged workforce. This works for retention. This works for quality metrics. Whatever it is that you measure organizationally, don't change it. Track it. Track it relative to your culture and engagement survey results. And so now you can start to assess the impact. And just give you a simple example. What do you measure? Let's just say let's start with revenue. And let's say you have an engagement survey. And you can start to see if and how those may be moving in tandem. And as Gartner would tell you, engagement will drive business results. So as your engagement scores up, you should expect to see business results go up as well. We contend that the reverse is also true. As you see your business results go up, you would expect your engagement scores to go up. Now, if this is not the case, this introduces anomalies and scenarios that you'll want to assess why it's happening, but you need to track it and have this information. And as we contend, we're telling you, put the culture assessment in there and see how these numbers are moving in sync or not. Now, ideally, as you minimize the degree of hypocrisy, your engagement scores will go up. As you implement your values and behaviors to differentiate your organization, the how you do what you do will influence your business results. The glue between the two. So now you have the framework. You can track this over time, whatever the periods are that you're measuring this data, but put them together, look for trends, look for anomalies, assess the impact of culture. And as you can see, track whatever business metrics are important to your organization. Here we replace it with retention, or maybe it's client satisfaction, or in our case, maybe it's zombies in the workforce. Maybe that's a proxy for engagement itself, but that's something that's important to our business. Are we doing an effective job of ridding the world of zombies in the workforce? But this gets to being intentional about measuring and assessing the impact. Once you have the data, now you simply need to consider the scenarios. And how would you respond? I'll just share a couple. There are plenty of examples here, but what does it look like? What is it telling you if you see culture scores start to dip, and maybe engagement scores are dipping with it, which we would predict, but that may not always be the case. So that's a whole nother scenario if they're out of sync. But what if you see culture and engagement scores start to dip and business results are actually soaring? I contend that's a red flag. And maybe you're sacrificing the long term for the near term. Maybe you're taking shortcuts. Maybe there are aspects of your organization that you need to say, wait a minute, what is causing this? Now, good business results is not a bad thing. But if they're coming because we're taking shortcuts in some of our values, then that's obviously a cause for concern and red flags, and something that you would rather address sooner than be in the newspapers later. And so it could be a leading indicator of that. So it's something to consider. You start to track these over time, you can see these trends, you can make adjustments. What about if culture soars, but the business results tank? And this can happen. I mean, well-intended businesses may not always be the most successful businesses, but it could raise some red flags as well. And maybe your internal focus is coming at the expense of external focus. Maybe your application of your values and behaviors is so focused on your colleagues and how we support each other, but it's coming at the expense of the clients and the impact that we're having. And maybe in this case, it's just a matter of looking at your core values and saying, okay, what about these behavior statements? And do we have sufficient behaviors demonstrating the application of those behaviors and values that will differentiate us in service to our clients? And maybe as you dive into the details and look at the survey and you start to see where the gaps are occurring, it provides further insights. So these are just a couple of simple examples, but really the key takeaway is you don't have to overcomplicate this. If you have existing tools, you can leverage those existing tools. If you don't, implement some simple surveys, leverage your intentional culture work, build your own assessment instruments, and track that which is important to you and see the correlation and how things are moving in sync or if they're not. And ask yourself the tough questions. So I want to leave you with a couple of reflections for consideration again. How can you assess the culture of your team and your organization, measure your degree of hypocrisy? Not hard. If you've done the work, you can just translate that to a frequency survey. Recommend you do that. And what can you do to correlate then to the business results, to engagement and the business results, quite honestly? And it's simply just tracking them over time, being intentional about some metrics. Don't overwhelm yourself with some metrics. Just have some key measures that are outcome oriented for your business. And then you've got these input measures related to engagement, related to culture. See how they move together, track them over time. And then as we just did, consider how you'll respond to various scenarios. What does it look like if things are moving in different directions? We can provide some simple guidance, some red flags, some warning signs that may occur, but you can dive into the details where you see lower results for specific behaviors or rituals and what you need to do in response to the results that you're receiving. So those are recommendations, things to consider. Next steps, well, obviously this is the last session. So thank you all for joining for all these sessions. Again, gather information. You could go back out to the landing page, as I mentioned earlier. If you missed any of the earlier episodes, they're all out there. You can go watch them at your convenience. You've got access to all the slides, all the activity sheets. You can expand your knowledge. There's additional details out there. If you're looking for any other feedback or recommendations, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Relative to apply, I challenge you, go out and read the activity sheet from this week. If you've done the work, develop a culture for your survey, your values, your rituals. Survey that. Establish a baseline. Repeat that. Track it over time. I just challenge you. Everything we've talked about over the last 6-7 weeks here, try it out. Don't say this is someone else's job. Be a leader. Try it out within your organization. If you're not running your organization, try it out with your team. If you're not running your team, try it out with your family. Go back and review episodes 1, 2, and 3 where I challenge you. Everything we're talking about, you can implement these things with yourself and with your family. Now, maybe you're not doing measurement surveys with your family, but you can define values and behaviors that reinforce those values and rituals that restore some sense of balance within your family and healthy perspective. Give it a shot. Would love to hear from you. Welcome the opportunity to have a conversation with any of you about that. I want to thank you all who have joined us for this series, Speaking of Healthy Balance. Wanted to remind everyone, we put the book, we knocked $10 off the price of the book during a 3-month period from the onset of social distancing. It's a great time to dive into your personal values, restore some balance, bring some culture to your life and your family. So encourage you to consider that. Also wanted to mention to you, I will be hosting a book club with the Association for Change Management Professionals forget what day, it's next week. If anyone is interested in joining us for that, feel free to email me. I'll send you the information. Would love to have you join us for that. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us for this series. I hope you've learned and will take some initiative about the culture and the organizations you represent. And with that, let me turn it back over to Maggie.
Thanks again, everybody, and thank you, Steve. I have sent the link to our webpage that has all of these and past sessions, activity sheets, presentations, and video recordings. Feel free to share this link and go back and look at some of these things. We really, really thank you for being a part of this, and have a great day, everybody.